Now we're going to work on the last section of the app, which is saving the data to the database called Room. First, in the build-up Gradle, make sure you have added the Room dependencies and updated the various version numbers as provided in the documents. We will be needing lifecycle as well, so make sure you add that in. And then click Sync. It will take a few minutes, but after that, you'll be ready to go. First off, we're going to start working on the local database. So first create a local checklist item that will be of type entity. Entities are tables inside Room database. So this will be what we will use to store the information. The data is going to be similar to the one we have already. So it's just going to have the primary key or the ID. And then it's going to have the text, whether it is checked or not, and whether it has focus or not. So after that, we're going to create the checklist style. This is the database which will be holding our local checklist item tables. We're going to create a few queries and different operations that we want to include. And so first off, we're going to include a query that selects everything from the table. We're going to be using calling coroutines here, so we will need to use a suspend function for this. And the data returned will be a list of the local checklist items. Next, we're going to add a method that will allow us to save the list of datas. We will want to add an onConflict so that in case there are merge conflicts, we're going to be able to replace it without having an error. Inside this function, we'll take in the list of items that we want to save. And then finally, we're just going to add one more insert, but this time it will be just inserting one item. This one will be used later on when we are creating the placeholder items. Next, we're going to create the local checklist mapper. This mapper is going to be responsible for converting the data from the local to the app model. This allows us to separate the two so that if we wanted to make changes in the future, we will not need to make it all over the place. So first, we're going to convert the checklist item into the local database model. Here, make sure you use the checklist item.content instead of just the checklist item base. And then you'll be able to extract all the parameters. For the second function, we're going to do the reverse, from the local database model back to our app model. The parameters are modeled so that they are one-to-one, but in some cases there might be some fields that you do not wish to save, or they're going to be saved in another table. So this separation allows you to do that, have that flexibility in the future. Next, we're going to create the repository. This repository will be responsible for fetching the data from the database, and we would normally add this layer so that we have the flexibility to choose our database design. So here we're using Room, but in the future we might use a different implementation, a different library, and using the repository separates this and gives it a layer of abstraction so that if we wanted to change it later on, we could. First up, we're going to have the checklist style, which is the database, as well as the mapper. We're going to create a new method here to get the list of checklist items. We're going to first fetch all the information from the checklist database, and then using the mapper, we're going to convert the data from the local database model to our app model. We're also going to create the method for storing it, and this is going to take in the list of items and similarly use the mapper to convert it from the app model back to the database model. Finally, we're going to add one more method that just saves the new item and takes in a single content item to save it in. Make sure when you import it, you also check it as checklist item.content and not just the base checklist item class. Now that we have the repository set up, we can move on to the next step. This is creating the actual database. So although we have defined just one table for our case, we may have multiple tables that we want to save in our app. This allows us to consolidate all of them into one place so that we will be able to find things more easily. And for this example, since we're just using one, we will just create a database linked to our single entity and then create the new method which will create our database. Make sure you extend Room database here. And now we're going to create the application module. So we're going to be making use of the Dagger library, which allows us to inject these references directly into our fragment or activities. This allows the activities or fragments to not have to instantiate those themselves, which would provide benefits in later cases, for example, when you're writing tests. Instead of creating the real implementation all the way down, you can mock several layers so that it will be more easily to isolate certain parts of your code for testing. First, we're going to need to here provide the app application. And once we have that, we're going to make use of this application to create the room database. As you can see here, the room database requires the app as a parameter. And how Dagger does it is that it looks through your modules and tries to find how it can be provided. And in our first method, we already provide this application, so it will know how to instantiate it. And finally, we're going to actually create our DAO, which will provide the operations for interacting with the database. And again, we're going to take in a database this time, and then just reference our checklist DAO directly. Finally, we're going to create a component. In Dagger, there are two main concepts, modules and components. Modules specify how those are created, and components will consolidate all different modules into one place so that you know how, so the Dagger graph will know how everything is created. Again, here is a simple case where we're just using one module, but in more complicated apps, we will have multiple ones. And we're just creating a new method so that we can inject our checklist fragment later on. So with that, everything is set up and ready to go. Inside your base application class, you would first create the application component via Dagger. When Dagger generates your component, it would prepend it with the keyword Dagger. So for our case, it's called Dagger application component. And then we would instantiate our module, which we will pass in the context and finally build it. Once we have the application context component created, we'll be able to go to our checklist fragment, and in the onAttach method, we want to reference the application, our app, and get the application component that we just created and inject. This means that we would be able to get all the required dependencies. In the previous step, we created the view model using this helper method, but this will no longer be the case because the view model will not take in a parameter, so this helper method will not work. Instead, we will inject it, and so the Dagger will create this for us. Inside the constructor, the checklist view model will now require the local checklist repository. To run coroutines, we will need to make use of view model scopes and launch. Here, you will be able to see that we're trying to get the list of items, and then after that, we are just appending the simple placeholder. And then finally, we're just going to update our state value with the new list of items. Remove the previous created code, and we would have everything set up now. Try to run the app and make sure that everything is running as it is. There should be no changes except that now you're getting your data from the local database instead of creating the hard code by hand. Now we're going to change our helper methods inside the view model. Starting with the onCreate, again, we're going to make use of the view model scope, and then we're going to get the list of items from our existing state. From there, we're going to first create a new dummy content. And after that, we're going to save this to our local database. Once this has been saved, we will be able to obtain the new items from our database again and add in the placeholder, and then update our state with these new values. remove the previously section of code. And so what we have done now is basically when we create a new item, we directly save it into our database. So even if we quit the app, we will be able to get that information again. Now that we're using coroutines, it's time to update our state as well. Instead of using live data, we'll be using something called state flow and mutable state flow. Conceptually, it is the same as live data, but now we are using coroutines, so making use of flows would be more useful. Instead of updating the state value, we will be calling state.emit with our items. Inside our fragment, we will also need to update this so that we will be launching from a lifecycle scope to collect the view model state. Once the value has been returned, we're doing exactly the same thing, which is passing on the new data to the onState change. Next, we're going to move on item text update. Similar to when we're creating a placeholder, we use a view model scope to launch the coroutine, and then we're just going to get the new updated items. Here, we're just going to bulk save the items. For now, this would be a case that works, but a good future change would be to just update the single row. Because when we're trying to save everything here, it works because we just have a small number of items. If you have a lot, let's say 100 or even 1,000, this operation could take a very long time and will slow down the user experience. Finally, we're going to update the checkbox updates. This is similar to the item text updates, where we're just saving the items in bulk. Again, it would be a good idea to change it to so that you can only save one item at a time and get the updated list that way. Finally, we're going to update the focus state update so that we can update the database again. With this, you can try to run the app. When you create a new item, it will be saved, and when you type in new text or select the checkbox, all of this will be updated into the database. Try to quit the app from the recent apps and relaunch it again. If it has been saved to the database correctly, you should get the data returned, and then it would show all these state correctly.